So I'm Stephen Lord and I'm here to kick things off. I've worked out that this is the 24th meeting, so we've been going nearly the quarter of the century, so it's amazing for those who are here from the beginning. So I was at a fundraiser last night at Neura, and I was sitting next to an invited guest, and I said we're having Falls network meeting tomorrow. You know, it's people all interested in falls. And she was surprised that there was such a thing, that so many people would be interested in fall prevention. So it's amazing that we can get all these people together for this important topic. And the other thing about it, I've thought, you know, every year we plan the meeting, what will we do different this time? And it doesn't take us very long at all before we've got a totally full agenda for the day and a program. And we always look at it and think this one is going to be the best ones ever, and I think this one is no exception. There's lots of interesting, innovative talks and initiatives all the way through the day. So we're going to do Slido. I don't have much in the way of housekeeping, the usual things about fire exits, you can see them, and certainly leave if you hear an alarm. And of course, mobile phones, make sure you do have them on silent. So we're going to get going, and as usual, as our custom, is always to have welcome to country, and we're very grateful again that we've got Uncle Chicka Madden, a Gadigal elder, here for that purpose. So if we welcome Uncle Chicka.
Yes, good, thank you. Good morning, folks. My name is Charles Madden, but known around the inner city of Sydney as Chicka. Now, that's a nickname that I got many, many years ago going to Redfern Public School, which is now NCIS, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence. Folks, I'm from Gadigal land, Aboriginal land. That's the land we're on at the moment. For many, many years, I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I've been involved with many different Aboriginal organisations over the years. I've been a director with the Aboriginal Medical Service at Redfern for over 40 years. Also a director with the Redfern Aboriginal Housing Company, Aboriginal Hostels Australia, and the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, where I am still a very active member. I've got to mention it, folks. Also a life member of the Redfern All Blacks Rugby League Football Club. Folks, for many, many years I've lived and worked around the city of Sydney. I'd like to take this opportunity this morning to extend a warm and sincere welcome to any of my Aboriginal brothers and sisters, non-Aboriginal brothers and sisters. If we have any brothers and sisters from the Torres Strait or further afar across the seas, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. Aboriginal land, the Gadigal clan is one of 29 that makes up the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bordered by 3 distinctive landmarks. We have the Hawkesbury River to the north, Nepean to the west, and the Georges River to the south. Those 3 rivers form the boundaries of the Eora Nation. Folks, if you've travelled across this great river, this great city of ours today, the state, or this great country, welcome. Welcome to Gadigal land. Enjoy your stay. Have a safe and trouble-free trip home. Once again, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Enjoy the day, folks. Thank you.
Okay, and now we'll move on to the opening, and it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Carrie Ma, Chief Executive of the Clinical Excellence Commission, to come up and open the day for us. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Uncle Chicka Madden. I can't see where he's gone. Oh, he's had to go. I thought that was a really heartfelt welcome to country. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Invited guests, delegates, lovely to see you here again. I can't believe it's been a year since I last spoke to you all. It's been a very quick year. Once again, we're looking forward to a really successful day of conversation, of learning, of networking. We actually have over 380 people participating today. And you are actually participating in a sellout event. No, people are waiting to get seats to come, and we had to turn people away. And that's always a real indicator that people are really interested in talking about how we reduce harm from falls. We're also web streaming the plenary sessions, and people will be attending online throughout the event, and you will be able to get recordings of the plenary events on CDs and DVDs once we're finished. There is one person I always like to thank particularly at the start of the conference, Esther, where are you? Esther Vance, who has done all of the organising for today's event, and I'm sure you'll want to come together and thank her at the end when you've been through what will be a great day. But today is a reflection and a celebration of a number of things, and one of those is the New South Wales Falls Prevention Network. We now have over 2,000 members, and we provided 14 rural scholarships for people to attend the forum today. That to me is an absolutely amazing way to make sure that we can extend the reach of the network and allow people to attend who might not necessarily have been able to do so. We've got a great programme. I've seen a number of the speakers, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. And our theme this year is moving right to stay upright. I had to look at my notes there because I couldn't say that quickly without watching. It's great to have a theme, and I think it would be great for us to think about the whole issue of mobilisation and falls and the relationship between them. Now, we've got the honour and privilege of hearing from a number of people over the programme. The PAM Albany guest presentation is going to be presented by Associate Professor Kim Delbert, and she's going to talk about, can the fear of falling make you unstable on your feet? Well, that'll be a really interesting way to think about what matters to patients and to consumers out there, because the fear of falling in itself is something that affects your experience. We also have the opportunity to hear from Professor Stephen Lord, who's opened the session this morning, and Associate Professor Gideon Kaplan, who you'll hear later on. But I do also want to extend my welcome to Christine Ewan. And we're very privileged that Christine's joining us today, and later today you're going to hear her mum's story. And so I do thank her. I don't know where she's sitting, but I do thank her for coming along today. We're all in the room because we've got a commitment to reduce harm and to improve the experience of care for our families, our patients, and the communities that we serve. And we're doing a number of things this year in New South Wales to help us do that. We've launched an initiative called the Leading Better Value Care programme, and it has 8 elements, but one of the work streams is going to be reducing falls for patients in acute hospitals over the age of 70. We do know in hospitals that is a vulnerable group of patients, and that we need to think in a quite disciplined way about how we can create more reliable care pathways for elders over 70. And it will be part of a wider patient safety programme that we will be establishing for frail elderly people, and linking falls to other areas like cognitive decline, delirium, nutrition, and looking at the whole experience of care for our frail elderly patients. The other opportunity we have here throughout the day is just to think about, as well as how we reduce harm, how we improve the experience of care for people, and how we think about what matters to those people we care for, whether they're in hospital or in the community. And although we're going to focus on hospital falls within the Leading Better Value Care programme, the CEC remains absolutely committed to continue to work with you to reduce falls in the community, because we do see and understand that that in itself is a growing issue that we need to think collectively about. So we do want to understand today what matters to those people we care about and we care for. And we also want to think about how can we talk about falls and harm and think about how we can be more proactive and more predictive about the risk that people have around falls, rather than reactive. And so I'm looking forward to hearing our thinking on that. And so as we move into the day, I've kind of walking into the foyer, the energy out there was enormous. I could feel it as I kind of walked through the foyer and into the room. So you're starting the morning with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of commitment, and a lot of energy between you. Please learn from each other throughout the day, network with each other, be prepared to challenge and be curious with each other about who is doing what to reduce harm, and start to think about how you can share what you're doing and inspire each other to do better for our patients and our communities. I wish you well, and I look forward to hearing on the outcome of all your conversations today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kerry. Now we'll make a quick start, and I'm going to hand over to Ms. Lorraine Lovett, who is the lead New South Wales Fall Prevention Program Clinical Excellence Commission, who's going to chair the first session. So welcome, Lorraine.
I believe the slider is meant to pop up, but it hasn't. So I'm going to tell you, we've got a large number of people from Community Health. Who's from Community Health here? Great to see you. A lot of work we can do out there, it's very positive. Acute, hospital? Great, thank you. Subacute? Smaller numbers, but you're still here, which is excellent. Some community service providers. Welcome, it's great to have you there. I love this forum because we've got such a broad network of people that we work with, and residential aged care. Welcome. I think it's fantastic, this forum, because we always have such a representation across our community of where people are driving to care for people who are getting older, and where they need staff to support them in what we're focusing on is how to keep people active and healthy into their older age, to live a comfortable life, if we can, and productive. So I've got the privilege this morning of introducing our 2016 Pam Albany guest lecturer, and today it's Associate Professor Kim Dilbare. Kim's a Principal Research Scientist in the Falls and Balance and Injury Research Centre at Neuroscience Research Australia and Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales. She is supported by a National Health and Medical Research Council Career Development Fellowship since 2012, and her research has contributed to the understanding of physical, psychological and cognitive factors causing falls. Her multidisciplinary approach incorporates elements from physiotherapy, psychology, brain imaging and software engineering towards preventing falls and promoting healthy ageing. Kim will talk today on Can Fear of Falling Make You Unstable on Your Feet? Thank you, Kim. So what we do here, we just press escape.
Can we just go to the slide?
It is new technology, sorry. You had it right.
Minimise it, yeah.
That's right.
There we go. Great.
You can use this if you want.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Lorraine, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you, Carrie, as well, for stressing the importance of fear of falling. So this is what I will talk to you about today, fear of falling, something that's been important for me in my research for quite a long time, so since I started my PhD in 2001. And what I will talk to you about today is the question whether fear of falling can make you unstable on your feet. So I'm a physiotherapist by background, with a strong interest in the psychological aspects of falls. So I'll start off by explaining a little bit about fear of falling, and then I'll continue in how we can possibly manage it. And I think the Slido will also ask you a question about my talk later. So what is fear of falling? So it's been researched for quite a while, and the main idea behind it is that it's a persistent feeling that an individual might have about a fear of falling or a risk of falling, having a concern and feeling not very confident to conduct daily activities without falling. So that's the essential idea. So that can be daily activities like simple, like quite strenuous daily activities, I mean. So for example, like walking on a slippery surface maybe, that can happen in a shopping center, but it can actually also evolve into more like just the general daily activities such as walking around in your own home. It is very common, and when we look at these figures, it's actually more common than falls. So if we look at people who have had a fall in the past, about 2/3 of those people would express a fear of falling. But even people who have not had a previous fall in the past year would express some fear of falling, so about 1/3. So it's a really big problem for all the people. It's more common in men, and it increases with age, and it has many associated factors. So, as you can imagine, falls is one factor that is quite important. So if a person has fallen in the past, it can affect their fear of falling, but also future falls. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. It's associated with physical factors. So if people experience a functional decline related to age or other medical conditions, if their gait is slightly impaired, if they have a reduced balance, that might affect their fear of falling. But what is also very important is these psychological associated factors. When we ask all the people with fear of falling a few more detailed questions, we often see that they have a reduced quality of life. They often express also symptoms of generalized anxiety and a depressed mood, and which can lead into social isolation. So that is really what is driving my interest and lots of people's interests in fear of falling, is how one thing can actually lead into a vicious circle and a negative spiral. So fear of falling can lead to a reduced level of activity, which can then lead to reduced physical function, as you can see on the graph here, difficulties in daily life, which can then lead to social isolation and fear of falling again. And all of these factors in themselves are known risk factors for falls. So is fear of falling all bad? No, it's not. So it does have a helpful side. And when does it have a helpful side? If it is a realistic appraisal of reduced functional decline. So as people get older, their physical function declines, and it's normal that not all the daily activities that they used to be able to do very easily, they might not go as easy anymore, and they might put themselves at risk of falling if they would do these. And such a fear of falling might result from a first-hand experience. So if they had a fall and they might realize, well, I should not do that the same way anymore. Or it can just be a result of an actual risk of falling, just expressed as a poor balance and reduced gait abilities. And if that happens, then fear is actually, or concern, is a normal adaptive response. And it's an insight that might actually prevent people from falling and from undertaking dangerous activities. So it's not all bad. But it does have an unhelpful side, and that is when fear becomes irrational, it becomes a phobia, and it becomes excessive in a way that it actually results in a persistent and actually a dysfunctional disruption of daily activities, but of attention and behavior in general. And that fear can result from a catastrophic thinking, like a thinking of the worst of events. And if that happens, then it will have a detrimental effect on several domains of life, which will result in a lower quality of life, a needless restriction, and that negative spiral that I mentioned to you before. So this is one scenario that could help, just showing how it can affect a person's quality of life. So this man, he fell on the marketplace, something that he really enjoyed doing, going to the markets every week, just getting his own groceries. But then he felt really embarrassed because he couldn't get up himself, which would be a very common problem. So he decided, I do not want to be in that situation ever again. So the solution for him was, I will not go to the market anymore, which resulted in social isolation and a lower quality of life. Just a few questions. So when you look at these pictures, how do you feel about your risk of falling during these activities? Just as a way to actually show that there is a helpful side. Not very worried, I presume, to walk down the stairs. Running to the phone? Well, probably okay. We all carry a mobile phone now anyway. How about this? I would be a little bit worried about that. The ladder doesn't look very stable. Or this scenario, walking on a slippery surface in a shopping market. So it is normal to have some fear of falling in some scenarios, and as you get older, they might become more common. So, but the question now is, like, how do we adapt? So when is it helpful and when is it unhelpful? And the way we have looked at this is we have looked at the perception of falls risk, which is actually fear of falling or concern of falling, and an actual falls risk, and we plotted this. So we actually expect people with a low actual risk to have also low perceived risk. So, and them we called vigorous. And on the other end of the spectrum, a high actual falls risk and a high perceived falls risk are the frailer people. But then we have the others. So we have people who not have a high risk of falling, but they think they have, so they're fearful. So we call them the anxious. And then on the other side, the people who do not have a fear, but have a high actual actual fall risk, them we call the Stoics. So just keep that picture in mind for just a second. So this is actually a graph plotted on those two variables of 500 people. And you can see that the relationship is actually not very strong. People are everywhere on this graph. So we would actually hope that most of the people would be sensible and would know what their actual falls risk is. But the relation is not that strong. And when we plot the people in those four groups, what we can see, though, is that about 30% of the people are vigorous. And of these people, about a fifth fall. And then we think about the frailer, so the aware people. We have about 40% of the general population and 40% of them fall. So this is quite sensible. So this is what we would expect. How about the other groups? So this is very interesting. Let's look at the anxious worriers first. It is luckily the minority of the population, so 10% of the people, but look how much they fall. They fall as much as the frail, aware people. 40% of them fall. And there is actually no reason objectively that when we assess their balance and all the other factors that we know are related to falls, there is no reason for them to fall, but still they fall. And then when we look at the Stoics, they're actually better off. So they have a high risk of falling, so they have poor balance, their gait is impaired, but they fall less, so they have about 30% of falls. So just in summary, what does this mean? So many older people, about a third, either under or overestimate their risk of falling. And the worriers, so the people who are too fearful of falling, they have a high falls risk, a high actual falls rate, despite having a low risk. And the battlers have a lower risk, despite having a higher actual risk. So fear of falling seems to lead to falls, independent of any impairment in balance or any impairment in gait. Who are these warriors? When they would come to your clinical practice, like who would they be? So they don't have any identifiable instability-related fall risk, so we can't really assess that bit. But what we do see is that these people have often a worse perceived health. So they would say their health is not very good at the moment. They have more depressive symptoms and they have a lower quality of life. And when we look at their personality profile, then we can see that there are stronger neurotic personality traits. So they have an increased vulnerability to develop irrational fears, probably had that for their whole life. But when we think about aging, physical decline is a normal process, so it does happen. And it requires a continuous adjustment of the perception of how well people are able to do certain activities. And sometimes that can be wrong, so it can lead to an underestimation or an overestimation at one point in time that will have to be adjusted at a later point in time to be safe. And based on their perception, they will have to select an appropriate behavior, an appropriate motor strategy, so that they are actually walking safely during their daily activities. But how do people achieve it? So when you think about that one scenario with the slipping in the shopping center, how would you adjust your gait? Just have a little bit of a think about that. What would you do when you think about how you would walk on that surface? We actually have tested this, not in younger people, in older people. We expose them to a higher risk of falling by actually putting them on a little bit of a platform. So we try to induce fear of falling, and we also dim the lights. We know that we actually induced fear of falling, and we had 4 different groups, the 4 different groups that I presented to you before. And what we saw is that the people who did not have a fear of falling, so did not, when we asked the question, not have a general fear of falling, they also adjusted their gait. So they had an appropriate reduction in gait speed. They had a bit of smaller steps that they took and wider steps. So that was the way how they adjusted it. But the people with fear of falling, they actually had an excessive reduction of their gait speed. They almost halved it, and they were exposed to the same situation, so there was no reason for that dramatic decrease. They had the same physical abilities as the other group. They were perfectly matched, but by doing this, by walking so slowly, they actually increased their risk of falling because they were walking in a less stable way. So this shows that fear of falling in itself, just as one factor, can actually increase falls risk in older people. So who are these battlers? The battlers are the people who have low levels of fear, They also have less previous falls. And when we look at their psychological profile, they're just emotionally more stable, they're less reactive to stress, and they're just happy people, satisfied with life. They have a better self-perceived health, even though they have the same issues as the next person, and they're also more active. So that's really the way to get old, is it? As the Aussie battler. So when we think about understanding fear of falling, so a previous fall, having poor balance, it can lead to fear of falling. And fear of falling can lead to avoidance behavior, which can be fueled further by negative thoughts and just end up in that vicious circle. But what we really want is that fear of falling, it will be there, but that it just leads to an adaptive behavior. So how do we do that? How do we manage fear of falling? What can we do in clinical practice to actually manage this better? One thing to keep in mind is especially this, like, what does fear of falling tell us? Like, if a person is coming to you and they say, or you've after asking a few questions, you know that they have fear of falling. The presence of it is actually a sign that something's wrong. So either the person has an accurate perception of their falls risk, so then we need to do something about that, or the person is actually spiraling into a vicious circle of general frailty through depression and other psychological factors, or a combination of both. So essentially, fear of falling, if a person has that something needs to be done. And lower levels of fear of falling are always better. Even though we thought it could lead to risk-taking behavior initially, we didn't see that. Most people are quite sensible about their risk. We all know this. I won't go into too much detail. Exercise prevents falls. If we give the right exercises that are moderately challenging balance and are being done 2 to 3 hours a week for over 6 months, we can reduce falls by about 40%. But what does it do to fear of falling? We actually did a systematic review about 2 years ago where we found 25 studies of over 2,500 community-dwelling older adults where there were described exercises that were developed and designed specifically to prevent falls. And we saw that there was overall a significant reduction in fear of falling immediately post-intervention. So this is just to show all the studies, and all the red diamonds on the right show that there was a significant reduction of fear of falling at the end of the study for these studies, with a larger diamond at the bottom showing the overall effect. But there was one thing. There was no significant effect of the exercise interventions on fear of falling beyond the end of the intervention period. So it didn't stick, it didn't last. So it did have an effect straight away, but it didn't last. So this shows that we need to do something else, and that is where a cognitive behavioral approach might actually come in handy. When we think about those negative thoughts, so they're the ones that actually induce the higher levels of fear of falling and the cautious behavior and the spiral, the negative spiral. We need to change those. We need to change those to positive thoughts, and that can then lead to an adaptive behavior and lower levels of fear of falling. And how do we do that? So when we think about cognitive behavioral therapy, obviously something that psychologists would be very good at doing for these people, but are there any psychologists here? Just by show of hands? There you go. So that's a problem. So it doesn't really, fear of falling doesn't quite often get addressed by psychologists in the health services at the moment. So it's all up to you guys to actually use these principles and just make sure that we help the large amount of all the people who present with fear of falling. And what are the best practice principles? This is obviously very simplified. But the first thing that we need to do is the cognitive part, so the cognitive restructuring of misconceptions. So we need to promote an overall view that is realistic of fear of falling and of falls risk of the older person. And we start by doing a bit of education about how common falls is, so they're not alone, but also by listening to them and their story, and just to see how dysfunctional and excessive it is for them, and just gradually try to just make that a little bit more realistic by talking to the person. And then the next step is the behavioral aspect. So there's two parts of that. One is, all right, so we'll try to problem solve it. So if you are afraid of getting in and out of the bath, we can install a handrail, for example. So work with the person to actually solve their problem and solve how they can reduce their fear of falling in a certain situation. And then the next step is, if they have actually stopped doing certain activities, to gradually start doing them again, which is called graded exposure. And it can be first time together with someone else or with appropriate help. And this has actually been tested in the Netherlands using a cognitive behavioral approach only. So it's called a matter of balance trial, where there were a large number of subjects, and this was actually repeated then a few years later, where there was an 8-week group session over 2 months, where people were just, all those different aspects of the CBT that I described before were done with the people using group sessions. And the result was good. So at 2 months, there was a reduction in fear of falling, there was no longer activity avoidance, and the daily activity levels went back to normal. And after 14 months, or after a year, that mostly stayed, but not in relation to activity avoidance, so that significance had disappeared. So I think the key to the solution of fear of falling is to actually combine them. So a physiotherapist or an exercise physiologist has a very strong role in this aspect. So when you give exercises to the older person who has fear of falling, just make sure that you also include some aspects of the CBT, of the cognitive behavioral therapy approaches in there. And stepping on is actually going quite a long way in that already. Because the CBT can help people to have a better anxiety management. It can reduce their attentional resources that they use now to actually think about this fear of falling, and they can then use it for other things, like to do dual tasking better, for example. And it can also increase their level of concentration. So that's the idea. So this still has to be tested. And another thing that cognitive behavioral therapy might be able to do very well, if you use it the right way, is it might also just reduce the loss of motivation and apathy regarding the uptake of exercise programs. So maybe it can actually help with long-term adherence as well of exercise. So in conclusion, so what do we know? Fear of falling can be a realistic appraisal of risk, but excessive fear can have adverse effects for mobility, quality of life, and actually also for falls. Exercise interventions are likely to both reduce falls, but also reduce fear of falling. And if we want to achieve long-term effects, it's important on fear of falling that exercises are also done for a longer time. So we just need to make sure we have this long-term adherence going on there as well. And that's why I think, and I think lots of people think it, that the most successful, or one of a good successful approach for falls prevention would be to combine exercise with some psychological and behavioral approaches as well, to increase the adherence and also reduce the fear of falling. Thank you.
Questions later. Questions? Got a question?
Yeah, can you flick the slide, please? So I've got some questions here.
I had a fall in the marketplace. I went in and I picked up 3 lovely punnets of strawberries. Walking around the corner, didn't see what was on the floor, went for a great skid, landed on my knee, and it was so embarrassing. The strawberries went everywhere, everybody was rushing to help me, and I can identify very clearly with that older gentleman who then was so embarrassed that he just wanted to get out of there. Fortunately, I'm a little bit younger, but I can see those, so I had to keep going. But I can see where, as you're getting older, that it can be a really terrifying experience, and you don't want to be embarrassed in front of in the community. So it's a very big issue, and particularly a great message for our community service providers. I'm sure you've got a lot of people in your care who actually do have a fear of falling, and that might be contributing to their lack of social activity and integration. So we have a question.
We have some questions. Firstly, we have a question for you, so please respond if you can. And there's a few questions here. First of all, I don't think there's any Wi-Fi, so that was a very well-liked question. But the other questions, please go to them, have a look at them and like them so we can know which question to ask him. They're just here, Lorraine.
You want me to go through these? What role does impaired cognition play in fear of falling?
That's for you, Kim.
That's for you.
Sorry, what was the question?
What role does impaired cognition play in fear of falling?
That's a really good question. So we know that fear of falling is actually quite common in people with cognitive impairment, so people with dementia, but also people with mild cognitive impairment. And the role it actually plays, we're not entirely sure. Like from a theoretical point of view, I can't really answer the question that well. But what we do know is that fear of falling in itself can actually take up a lot of attentional resources in your brain, so it actually affects your executive functioning and it affects your processing speed that way. So it also reduces your level of cognitive abilities that are available for you during your daily activities. So that is why and how possibly impaired cognition could actually amplify that effect of fear of falling on falls and actually make it more likely to have a bit of an unrealistic fear of falling because they might just not get that right perception of their fall risk. It's hard when you don't know who the question comes from.
What outcome measure do you feel best assesses fear of falling?
So, what outcome measure do you feel best assesses fear of falling? So, one thing that you can do is just ask, are you concerned of falling during certain daily activities? And if you want to go a little bit more specific, actually ask a few more specific questions. But there are quite a few really good questionnaires available. So one that is well validated is available throughout the world as just a paper-based questionnaire is a Falls Efficacy Scale International. It's been translated in a large number of languages. And one that we also have developed ourselves at NURA is the Iconographical Falls Efficacy Scale, which is actually available on the App Store if you want to have a look at that. So that is available on iPads to assess in your clinic using 30 questions. So that is a very detailed questionnaire. It doesn't take too long to assess.
I'm going to take one more from here and then we'll ask questions from the floor unless you're still busily popping them in here. With the lack of psychologists involved in this, what about occupational therapists doing CBT for fear of falls?
Yeah, why not? Definitely. So I think we all have a role in here. So even though we're not necessarily trained to do cognitive behavioural therapy according to the state of the art, we can all use those principles to just make our practice better. And definitely, I agree, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, exercise physiologists, we all play a role here, nurses. That cognitive restructuring is mostly about educating people and listening to people and just offering them solutions for a problem that they are really bothered with and that is affecting their quality of life. So I can't see how we can't help in that. So yes, for sure.
So Kim, before you on the screen, which is up here, is a word map for the first question that you asked, and the ones that are the bigger ones is the most answers to that. That's what they've given. Do you want to make a comment on what you're seeing there?
Yeah. So, and that is, it's definitely true. So, so what you see here is that I expected to see this actually as a response of this question. Previous falls is the most common reason why older people would express a fear of falling, but it's not the only reason. It's actually, like when you look at those people who have not had a fall in the past year, they still have a higher, like about 1/3 of them have a higher fear of falling. So all those other aspects that you can see in the smaller writing, which is a little bit harder to have a look at, but like having felt embarrassed, that might also be associated with a previous fall. But just, the general physical decline, certain environmental changes, both outdoors and indoors, and poorer health, cognitive impairment. So all of those actually catastrophizing in general, they're all quite important. So it's actually a good summary of what is available in the literature of what actually leads to fear of falling.
Thank you. How are we going for time? One more? Any other question? A question from the floor, if you haven't fed one into the Slido? There's one up there. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Megan Swan, and I'm the co-author of the Stepping On program. I just wanted to thank you very much for mentioning Stepping On, because that's what we use exactly, the behavioural cognitive process and exercises. So everyone can do that program. It's a huge behavioural cognitive component. So. I just thought I'd had to say something about it.
Yeah, no, that's true. It is a wonderful program, and it actually does combine both of those aspects together, which are so important to prevent falls. But the main key there is to actually the long term. So the long term adherence to exercises is very important, to just make sure that whatever you do in the course of stepping on, that it actually has a long term effect.
So, Kim, you can't run away. Just like to present you with a recognition of the Pam Albany guest lecture, and that'll be good for you. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to note that the Pam Albany guest lecture honours the work of Pam Albany. Many of you will have known her as a passionate advocate for accident and injury prevention in her various work roles, and she was a key facilitator in enabling the work that we're now doing on an evidence-based practice. And also to note that we're very fortunate at this point that New South Wales Health has funded Stepping On programs across every LHT. We've been funded until the end of 2018 at this stage. And for those of you who may not be aware of it or want to know where those programs might be running in your local health district, I urge you to go to a website that we've built called Active and Healthy New South Wales. You can Google it, and on there you'll find a way into, you key in a local district or name of a suburb, and if the program's running, it will show up there in that particular area or close by. And there'll be further information that we can provide on the literature and so on that we've got on our table outside. I'd now like to introduce Professor Stephen Lord, who's a Scientia Professor at the University of New South Wales and Director of the Falls, Balance and Injury Research Centre at Neuroscience Research Australia. Stephen has published over 400 papers in the areas of applied physiology, instability, falls and fractures in older people, and is an acknowledged leading international researcher in this field. His research follows two main themes: the identification of physiological risk factors for falls and the development and evaluation of fall prevention strategies. A key aspect of this research has been design, implementation and evaluation of exercise programs for the general population of older people, as well as for those identified as being at increased risk of falls, that is, people with Parkinson's disease, stroke, dementia and frailty. His methodology and approach to falls risk assessment has has been adopted by many researchers and clinicians across the world, and is actively engaged in initiatives aimed at implementing falls prevention evidence into policy and practice. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorraine. Another year for an update, and when we do this, usually Esther and I and a few others get together and we think up what we'll present. And if you look at the back, I think we've been too ambitious. I think we had about 5 or 6 projects, and I don't think I could present them all. And since we put that together, I've been to 2 conferences, one in Britain and the Australian and New Zealand one, and I wanted to put 2 more updates. So there's no slowdown in really interesting initiatives for fall prevention across the world. So what I've decided to do in the end is I'm going to present 1 on understanding falls risk and 4 on interventions, because that's the key to fall prevention. So initially, I'm going to talk about some work that a PhD student of Jasmine Manat and mine has been doing over the last 3 years. And it's been aimed at trying to understand gait adaptability. So our ability to change our walking pattern or our gait quickly and appropriately when we need to. So the idea behind this is to go from something that's, I guess, more ecological, something that really does start to mimic real-world experience. When we first started with fall risk assessments, many of the tests certainly do predict falling, things like body sway and simple transfers, but possibly we can learn much more about falls risk if we actually start to mimic real-world activities. So this is important because in the community, most falls occur while we're walking, and they occur generally by trips and slips as we're walking along. And so being able to adapt your gait voluntarily is one important mechanism to avoid a fall by a trip or a slip if you see an obstacle. So this gait adaptability itself does refer to this ability to alter the gait pattern, and this can occur quite frequently. We need to do this when we're walking around in the environment, crossing streets, negotiating obstacles, or an uneven surface. The figure on the right there is me sometime back in Havana, where the hazard there was so deep I would have disappeared into the footpath if I hadn't been able to adapt my gait to walk over the obstacle. So this is the setup, and this is Joanna's invention. It's really evolved from choice stepping reaction time, but to move this into walking. And so the way this worked is we had a walkway, and we had a setup where 2 steps ahead we could present a stimulus to the person where they either had to step on it as a target or they had to avoid it as an obstacle. So this was undertaken on a gait right mat, and the obstacles were virtual. They were projected from the ceiling from 3 torches into different spots. So we've got an example here where we worked out the person's normal step length. So 2 steps ahead, they would be normally stepping into this zone here, and that with an automated heel switch, a stimulus would be projected onto the floor. So in this case, it was a pink obstacle that got projected onto the screen, onto the floor. And so at that particular point in time, the instruction was to avoid it. So the person has stepped to the side and then they've kept walking. So that you can imagine that one is the hole in the ground, the banana peel, the hazard. Alternatively, it could be to step on a short target, which was indicated by green. So at 2 steps ahead, they had to alter the gait pattern and keep walking, or the third condition was a longer one, just past normal step length. So again, this time, you would have to step on the target by taking a longer step to have success. We also had standard walk-through trials, so that there was no stimulus at all and you just kept walking. So at the start of each trial, you wouldn't know what your response was going to be. It could be one of 4 things. It could be just walk through, avoid an obstacle, step short, step long. So it was all about gait adaptability and the ability to do that just 2 steps ahead. And they were all randomised, so it was unpredictable. So we classified, I think this might work. Yes, great, I hadn't had a time to test it. So that's the pink target. You can see this is actually a person with Parkinson's disease, and as he comes along 2 steps ahead, you can see the pink target projected onto the floor. He takes a short step, successfully avoids it, and keeps walking. So that's how we looked at this. We looked at differences between young and old, and then we went further to look at people at low and high fall risk to see if this was a variable, a measure that did discriminate between those at a low and a high risk of falls. It was based on previous falls and performance in the physiological profile assessment. And what we found is when we looked at the 2 groups, the low fall risk group and the high fall risk group, there were significant differences in 2 important measures. Those who were at risk of falls slowed down a lot more in approaching in the step before the target, so they had to slow down, not quite freeze, but they were more likely to approach it in a slow way. And as well as that, they made more errors, so they stepped on the pink and could not manage to step accurately onto the green targets. So it was 2 problems. So it was not a speed accuracy trade-off. There was 2 issues. Despite slowing down, those at risk of falls also made more errors. So there was a double problem in those at higher risk of falls. Just quickly, we then went to see, well, why is this the case, with a number of different explanatory measures. And we had a measurement of executive functioning to look at cognition, a measurement of strength to look at the physical side, and also the fear of falling measure. And all of those partially explained the difference in falls risk. So all of those, the fear, the physical component and the executive functioning all had an impact on explaining the difference between the fallers and the non-fallers for the gait speed. And the primary one, the main explanation for the errors, was just executive functioning. So that comes back to that cognitive domain. So to conclude from this one, it's a measure of ecology. It's not going to be a simple clinical test we can put into clinics, but it does give us some insight into what actually is happening as people are walking along in challenging environments. People at risk of falls do worse in it. It's mediated by a number of explanatory measures related to physical functioning, cognition and fear. And it gives us another target as to what we might be able to include in interventions. If we can build into our exercise programs some measures of gait adaptability, maybe that will transfer over to the real world as well. So it's a matter of imagination as to how we could put that into our exercise programs. So now 2 interventions and what's been trialled in the last year. Going to start with social dancing. This study where Daphne Merrin was the driving force and conducted this study over a number of years. It's been a question that a lot of people have thought was something definitely worth testing because of the social component of dancing, the interaction, the fact that it might be engaging and fun, and have a lot of stepping and balance components to it, and thinking components. So it's a study that was funded by the NHMRC and was conducted well with a randomised control trial design. So this was done here in Sydney. It was conducted in retirement villages, 23 of them in all, so a very big study, and there was cluster randomisation. So this works differently to standard randomisation. Whole villages were randomised to either receive the dancing or be a control village. So all in all, there were 23. Where there was an intervention, it was either folk dancing or ballroom dancing. There wasn't a choice. It depended on the availability of a teacher. It was conducted over 12 months with a total of 80 hours of dance in that period of time. You can see the uptake there, 12.3%. Doesn't sound good, but it's pretty typical for lots of research trials. And as I mentioned, the participants were randomised to either the social dancing 12 villages or the wait list, the control 11 villages. And lots of people all together, as you can see, 279 and 251, so definitely powered for falls as an outcome measure. So we get to the findings. Lovely concept, but it didn't work. I think that's the number one outcome from this study. No matter how we looked at it in terms of outcome measures, there was no effect on fall rate, and there were lots of other interesting secondary outcome measures that we may have had a benefit that related to balance, strength, central processing speed, and so on. There was one small change, an improvement in gait speed, particularly among the boiler room participants, but that was one out of many, many comparisons. So on balance, it looked like it did not prevent falls or improve the mediating measures of physical and cognitive factors. There was also one other slightly concerning factor, that if people had fallen 2 or more times in the year coming into the study, they actually did worse with the intervention than the control, so are more likely to fall in the trial period. So maybe that was an indicator of them being more frail. So I'm not sure if you can see the figures there, but in general it shows that among all of the comparisons there was a trend, a very much a non-significant trend for, if you're in the intervention group, you were at slightly increased risk of falls across those various categories, and it did reach significance for those who'd had 2+ falls in the past year. So to conclude from that one, what can we conclude? Well, this particular intervention, if it's conducted in this particular way, cannot be recommended as a fall prevention intervention. And so there was a lot of soul searching undertaken to think, well, you know, it's such a good idea, why did it not work? And some of the ideas that came up was that, well, adherence was not as good as it could have been. It was only on average 51%, and maybe there was a mix of people of different abilities in the one training group, and it may have been a little harder for the ones with less ability. So a conclusion from the authors here was that maybe we need to take some of the, the structured stepping components and make it more structured rather than just more free-form dance. So it is interesting. It's difficult to conclude that dance is not an effective fall prevention intervention. I think the top one is the take-home message. The way this study was done, even though it was done as rigorously as possible, we shouldn't just replicate this model. Interestingly, we thought that adherence would be great because it's a social activity and it's really going to be something that's got a form. It involves all these different social and executive function type components. But with only 51% adherence, it wasn't any better than any other structured exercise program. And to some of that, I think, relates to that being done in a retirement village where it's not as if it's a social activity where people are coming from the community to meet new people. I guess everybody came from the same address, and we had the usual issues of no men turning up and women taking on the role of the man in the ballroom dining. So there were all these issues that were always limitations. So the concept of great social interaction maybe didn't happen in this particular intervention. So, Tai Chi, we hear a lot about Tai Chi, and systematic review evidence suggests that it is one of the effective exercise strategies for preventing falls. A number of particular studies have been done in quite a few countries. This one was undertaken in Thailand, and it was interesting because while it didn't look at falls as an outcome measure, it was smaller than that. It looked at the effect of Tai Chi in a group with mild cognitive impairment, so a group greatly increased risk of falling. And it had a number of surrogate outcome measures, particularly measures related to cognition, executive functioning, and also to physical risk factors for falls. So it was a standard randomised control trial. It involved Tai Chi, and it was a combination of centre and home-based training. So 3 sessions in the centre to explain the components of Tai Chi, then the remainder of the time spent at home. An RCT and adults aged 60 and over who met the Peterson's criteria for mild cognitive impairment, and that's the most robust criterion for this condition. It's based on a lot of neuropsychological tests, subjective complaints, and activity of daily living classification. And as I mentioned, 3-week intervention, 12 weeks altogether, 50 minutes per session, 3 times a week. And so at the end of the trial, there were some really quite positive findings this time. There was improved performance in LM is logical memory. That's a test of delayed memory. Block design, which is a measurement of crystallised intelligence. I can stop that guy. Crystallised intelligence in the Tai Chi group compared to the control group, and also improvements in a number of different physical measures as well related to the physiological profile assessment. In fact, most of them are strength, reaction time, postural sway, and even lower limb proprioception, all improved in the Tai Chi group. So if you can read that at all, basically the right column, you can see many of the measures, none were left out. These were all showed significant improvements in both the cognitive measures and the physical measures. It's quite exciting in some ways because there's been, lots of studies directly related to brain training don't show too many great outcomes in terms of cognitive measures. And I think on balance there might be more evidence that physical training and exercise training is showing to have greater effects on some cognitive outcome measures. Also, step training exercises are showing the same benefits. And just in summary, the group started out at about the same composite physiological falls performance score when they commenced the study, and this is where they finished. So you can see the control group definitely at elevated risk compared to the Tai Chi group. So it's not a substantial change, but it's definitely in the right direction of reduced falls risk compared to population averages. So improvements there from Tai Chi in both cognitive outcomes and physical outcomes. I suppose, sometimes you look at a study and you think that's fantastic, it's a small study, more likely to have a biased effect. And so like with all things, it does need replication in another study, but it's on the consistent, I guess, with many studies to show benefits of Tai Chi, particularly for physical functioning, and some encouraging results also for cognition. Now the next one is more of a high-tech one. This study was undertaken in a number of centres in Europe, and it was looking at virtual reality. So it was basically a virtual reality-based intervention, which was done on a treadmill, and the control group in this case was not usual care or no intervention, it was treadmill training. So the only difference between the intervention group and the control group was the addition of the virtual reality component. And so with this study, there were 202 participants assigned to either the treadmill training plus the virtual reality or just the treadmill training alone. And it was centre-based, so it was very clear whether or not people did the intervention because they all came into the centre to do the intervention. So you can see it's more intensive because it could only be done one-on-one. It's not something you can do in a group. So an individual would come in, do the training either with the VR or not. It was undertaken just 6 weeks, with each session lasting about 45 minutes, and a structured training progression was individualised, so it could become more and more difficult for those who had the virtual reality component. And interestingly, and not ideally, the participants who took part in the study were of 3 types. So they either had a history of falls, 109 of them, mild cognitive impairment, 43, or Parkinson's disease. So they were all within the study. When they did the randomisation, it was stratified for these 3 conditions, so there were equal numbers in each group, in the intervention and the control. But it was powered overall for everyone, not for the individual subgroups of people. So this is not a very good picture, but it gives you an indication of what was happening. The intervention for treadmill training was just walking on the treadmill, but for the virtual reality component, there was a screen in front of the participant and they would have to negotiate a path. So as they looked onto the screen, it was not fully immersive, it was just a screen. They would see multiple paths which they would have to choose and adjust their stepping, a little bit like gait adaptability. they would have to walk over virtual obstacles, etc. So they were continual adjustment of the walking pattern. So very much a training of the gait adaptability pattern. And this study was successful in preventing falls. They have the results here in the fall rates before the trial and after the trial in the 6 months. So the intervention just being 6 months, but they measured fall rates over 6 months. And irrespective of the fall rates at the beginning, the difference in the fall rates over the 6 months after the trial was significantly different. So those who had the virtual reality component had significantly fewer falls than those who had the treadmill training alone. So a significant finding from something that was quite a brief intervention. These are the results overall because they did look at the subgroups, and I've just shown you the pattern there in general. So looking though more closely at the final 6 months, which is the main outcome measure without taking into account the first falls, there were some interesting subgroup analyses, and this is where it's always risky when you do this sort of thing, because sometimes you get a bigger benefit in one group, but always that means you've got a less benefit in another group. So what did it show? So if I can show this on the mouse, is that coming up? No, only on my screen. Okay, anyway, on all participants on the left, we've got the incident rate ratio on the top for the the treadmill group, and on the bottom for the VR. So the 6 being lower than the 8.7 is a significant difference in the fall rate, and that's the p-value of 0.03. So if we're looking at the other groups, so we don't get the same patterns. The people with the idiopathic falls, that means they had one or more falls. The event rate is actually much higher in the intervention group than the controls. So there was actually a near trend for that going in the opposite direction. Similarly, basically no different for the group with MCI, but on the right, the big effect here in Parkinson's disease, where the actual overall incident rate ratio was less than half, so it halved the rate of falls in that group. So if you look at that as a whole, the whole effect of the intervention was basically to do with the improvement in the Parkinson's disease group. Now the authors draw attention to this, of course, though it's particularly important in Parkinson's disease, but why did it not work in other people? So that's always the trouble with these subgroup analyses. Why did it work in the opposite direction in people who had past falls? So you can only start to make suppositions about why that might be the case. So we take the initial hypothesis for the group as a whole, and we do get a significant reduction. So it's encouraging that an intervention like this has beneficial effects. The last one I'm going to talk about is, I don't have it in the program, but I got excited about it in New Zealand because it's one of the first studies that's been published about flooring in this case, a hospital. So this study was undertaken when a new hospital was built in Christchurch, and they had the opportunity to put in some shock-absorbing flooring. So I've got a couple of them here to give an indication of what they're like. So basically, the idea with the shock-absorbing flooring is you have a hard surface on the top, but underneath you have some cells that absorb any forces. So I can scrunch that up in my hand, but on top, if you press down on it, it's pretty firm. It's not as firm as concrete, but it has a stable top, and you can put a carpet tile on top of it as well. So that's one example of a shock-absorbent floor. So this study was opportunistic and very pragmatic because Carl Hanger had the opportunity to put this in with a new hospital being built. So the aim was to see if fall rates within the bedrooms that were fitted with the low-impact flooring would prevent fall-related injury, not falls, compared to vinyl flooring. And it was prospective. They had 20 beds where they could put this into place. And they monitored all floors, as you would expect, with incident reporting, noting the location and the consequences. So a lovely intervention in that all you need to do is put in the flooring, because falls are recorded automatically, so it could be done quite cheaply in general terms as a study. And the people were followed up for a long time and were measured in terms of falls per 1,000 bed days, particularly looking at injuries and only those that were where the falls occurred in the bedroom, because that's the valid control comparison. Now, being pragmatic, they didn't use just one type of flooring, they used 3 types. So they are the ones, Smart Cell, which I think is this one, which is 25 millimetres thick, and some thinner ones as well. So there was 4 beds each, 3 with different types of flooring, and the control groups basically had concrete floors with a very thin piece of lino on them, standard sort of flooring. So what were the results? So they did this for 31 months, which was enough time to collect enough falls. In fact, 278 of them in that time from 178 fallers. And overall, the first finding, which was an important non-significant one, is there were no more falls on the soft flooring than there were on the hard one. So that's important because it could be theoretically possible if you're on a softer floor, you get less proprioceptive feedback and you might fall. Exaggerated on something like a mattress or a sponge, but that wasn't the case. But the important finding is the second one, that there were significantly fewer fall-related injuries in the bedrooms that were fitted with the compliant flooring. So a significant reduction, so 22% versus 34%. And fractures were down, but the study was not sufficiently powered to detect that as a significant difference. Now, did the staff like it? And the answer to that is no. The one problem with these is, even though it's fairly firm on the surface, to be shock absorbing, it does have problems with rolling equipment over it. So equipment sinks into the floor a little bit and you've got to push it much harder. So that was the downside. So it was, they looked at staff thoughts on it and they didn't like it, basically. But these are the outcome measures, and you can see minor injuries, moderate injuries and serious injuries were all reduced on the shock absorbing flooring. One thing that Carl points out is it doesn't totally prevent hip fractures. Some hip fractures did occur when people fell onto the softer floors. So I usually finish with the gold bars, but I'm not going to this time. I thought I'd concentrate on the studies. We'll append those to the printed talk that'll be available on the web, but we're really waiting the new Cochrane collaboration studies that are going to come out within the next year. So there are going to be 4 of those looking at different aspects of fall prevention, from the environment to institutions to community and exercise. So hopefully next year we'll be armed with all of the latest evidence from fall prevention in a systematic review. So I'll leave it there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I almost thought for a moment we had a very simple and thing we could implement into our acute care facilities to reduce harm from falls, but it looks like we've still got a bit more work to go.
A bit more work, and the discouraging thing from the study in Christchurch, the hospital thought there was not enough evidence to actually put them in, and they've got all hard floors in the hospital right through.
Yeah, I think this is a burgeoning area of research and work into the future, and one would hope it is taken into consideration when we're looking at new designs for our hospitals as well. We have time for some questions. Does anyone want to ask Stephen a question? Raise your hand and we'll run a microphone to you. Who's chilly in here? I'm quite chilly. Is anybody else feeling chilly? We'll see what we can do about the air conditioning as well. You got a question?
Over here.
No?
Yes, over here.
There's one there. I'm sorry. Yep. We've got a question.
Hello, Steve. Thank you for your presentation. Just in regards to the first study about dancing, I just wonder if there was any significant difference in, if there were differences in relation to Parkinson's, people with Parkinson's disease, because I've seen studies relating dance with improved function for people with Parkinson's disease.
Okay. I think it was an exclusion criterion. I'm sorry, I don't have the detail, but often in these studies we exclude people with a neurodegenerative disease that actually might change over the course of the study and increase falls risk independently. I'm guessing that was the case here because I'm afraid I didn't look at the detail of that. So my short answer is I don't know, but I haven't seen the data on. In theory, if something was structured that included dance routines and stepping, and people did it, you would think it's going to have definite benefits.
Question in the middle.
Hello, I'm Jenny. I'm from Melbourne and I work in an acute hospital and also in the community. Just comment about the dancing again. I actually do a program called Jazzercise, and there might be somebody else here that does it, I don't know. And when I was starting out in that program, I was told that you had to do it at least 3 to 4 times a week to get improvement. So doing dancing twice a week, I wouldn't have thought you'd get a lot of improvement necessarily.
No doubt the greater the dose is probably and will definitely an advantage. If we based our if we could extrapolate from the systematic review that Cathy has led, it really comes down to 2 seems to be often enough, as long as it's intensive, as long as it has a strong balance component. There's no doubt 3 or 4 is better, but 2 seems to be a bare minimum, and I think that this was the basis in this study in that what was going to be practical, it was a very pragmatic trial, what would people do? No doubt 3 is better, but 2 seems to be a bare minimum for exercise, provided it's got a strong balance component.
Because the Tai Chi one was 3 times a week, wasn't it?
It was. 3 is definitely good, yeah, but as I mentioned, 2 might be the bare minimum.
Thank you.
Another question.
Hello, Stephen. My name is Amanda. I'm from Macarthur Home Modification Service in Sydney. I'm an OT, and I'm keen to talk to you about the flooring, the last study. Was there a corresponding increase in injury with the staff who complained about the flooring?
Injury in the staff?
Yeah. Did they actually injure as a result of the flooring and pushing the equipment?
No, they just did not like it. I asked Carl that question. I said it was non-randomised as well. So I thought, well, that could be a bias from the staff. That might put either people who thought they were at risk of falls into those with the compliant flooring, or they might have another bias because they didn't like the flooring. They might leave those ones till the end or something. He couldn't really answer it. He thought, he just didn't know. But he thought overall there would not have been an indication to put high fall risk people into it because basically they didn't like the flooring. Okay, there were 5 people in the dancing study with Parkinson's disease, just a small proportion. Not big enough to look at those separately for an outcome event.
Another question? Okay. Thank you, Stephen, as always. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.